Behind every breakthrough is a simple idea, and Before I Was CEO reveals the ones that matter. We will focus on what it says about company and time. Stay with me, the best part is near the end. Chapter 1: The Dot-Com Crisis. The story of Chris Gopalakrishnan, Infosys. The story of David Kenny, IBM, Cont D. The story of Raf Kustermans, Plumbee. The unraveling and lessons learned. Chapter 2: Practical Advice. The stories of Gail McGovern and Patrick. Have they faced challenges along the way like anyone else? Or did they live through more adversity than most, making them stand out from the crowd? In this first part of the book, we'll meet people whose career is defined by adversity. They emerged as leaders through their ability to cope with it or even turn it in their favor. But even for those who eventually thrive, dealing with adversity doesn't always come easy. That's what we'll learn in this first part of the book. In Chapter 1, you'll meet Orit Gadish, chairman of Bain & Company, and David Kenny, general manager of IBM Watson. Both are doing extremely well, and so are their companies. But back in 1990, the company they both worked for was in great financial trouble. How did they cope with it, and what did they learn from it? In Chapter 2, we turn to external shocks that affected nearly everyone: the dot-com crisis and 9/11. We'll meet 3 individuals who led a company that was active during the Internet era, and learn how they reacted when that bubble came crashing down. One of these people is someone introduced earlier in the book, David Kenny, then CEO of Digitas. The other 2 are Chris Gopalakrishnan, one of the founders of Infosys, and Raf Kustermans, the founder of Cyganet. Through these individual stories, we'll attempt to answer the following question: how do you deal with adversity? Chapter 1: Finding True North. The stories of David Kenny and Orit Gadish. Chapter 3: Boston, 1990. I got an outside offer, the man said as he walked into the office of Orit Gadish, a 37-year-old partner at Bain's Boston headquarters. Should I take it? For the past several months, managers and partners had been leaving the firm in droves. The up-and-coming consulting firm had gotten in trouble through a dangerous cocktail of poorly managed debt, an opaque governance structure, and a reputation for being too hot to handle that had gone sour. Now, as Orit was working alongside other partners to ensure the survival of the company, the man in front of her was likely to be the next in line to get out, and she couldn't blame him. Like him, she was talking to headhunters about options outside the firm. Orit, I don't want to be the last one left on the sinking ship, the man said. I know everyone is talking to them. A few offices further down the hall, a young consultant was having similar concerns over his future. Having switched just 6 months earlier from GM's Young Potentials program to Bain, the Michigan-born David Kenny had hoped the consulting firm would give him a chance to learn about more industries and see more of the world. For now, however, it looked like the only thing he was going to learn more about than at GM was bankruptcy. Don't pay attention to the restructuring, Bain's CEO, Mitt Romney, told Kenny. That was easier said than done. People were leaving, and the company was in dire straits. What were Gadish and Kenny supposed to do? Chapter 4: Israel. In that war, the Zionist Israeli army defeated an Arab military coalition including Egypt, paving the way for the Zionists to establish Israel as an official Jewish state in Palestine. Many of the first Israeli settlers were immigrants from Europe, and Grunfeld's parents were no exception. Her father had emigrated from Germany, her mother had come from Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Empire, where Jewish people had been persecuted by means of pogroms, a form of ethnic cleansing. Or it told me that her father did a sensitive job in the young Israeli state, working as a defense force colonel in the army. She explained her father was asked by David Ben-Gurion to change his name to a Hebrew name. He chose to combine the first letter of his last name, G, and Dish, the Hebrew word for Grunfeld, his German name. Just like every young Israeli, Gadish had to fulfill a mandatory service in the army when she graduated from high school. It was through that experience, she said, that she learned how to lead in times of crisis. I was 17 when I started my service, and was appointed to work for the Deputy Chief of Staff. In hindsight, it may seem as if she got that job because of her father's role in the army, but she assured me that wasn't the case. He was known in the army as Grunfeld, and she was admitted under the name Gadish. The role I had was part of the basic training every Israeli performs in the army, she said. But I was younger than most, as I graduated early from high school, and got special permit to join the army at 17. I was selected to work for the Deputy Chief of Staff office. I had been a grade A student. But it was a huge responsibility, and I was fortunate to be selected. Her most vivid memory of that period, she said, was when she was present in the war room during a conflict situation. While Israeli soldiers in the field were risking their lives in a combat situation, the army generals had to decide on their strategy. The war room was in a bunker, so we were physically all very close to each other, with the chiefs of staff, the people that ran the army in that particular time, all there. I was merely listening in, but I could hear what was going on in the field hundreds of miles away. She saw how the generals often followed the advice of those in the field, no matter what their rank or title was. In the Israeli army, you lead from the front, not from behind, Gadish said. People in the war room were making decisions based on imperfect information. I listened to the debate and saw how they went about that. There was always consultation. Sometimes the generals in the room were several levels higher up in rank from those on the ground. But if the person on the ground was under fire and said, "I need to do this," then the generals would say, "Yes, go for it." What she took away from that, she said, is how as a leader you should trust your people, how you work under extreme stress, and how you work as a team to come up with the best possible decisions. At that age, it's something that you never forget. After completing her service, Gadish went to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and got a bachelor's degree in psychology and human geography, her minor. She was a top student, and she planned to stay in academia. "I always thought I was going to be a professor in Jerusalem," she said. So after earning her degree, she looked for a master's and PhD program to eventually become a professor. But things turned out differently. While looking for a PhD program abroad, she came upon a highly selective but prestigious double degree in the United States, the Harvard MBA-PhD program. "I didn't know anything about accounting, finance," she said. "And I couldn't imagine getting a PhD without having an MBA as a basis." The idea of going for an MBA in the United States was crazy. According to Gadish, every business school required that you did economics before, only Harvard didn't. It was literally the only school I could apply for. They looked for leadership grades instead. Most people in my country said I was crazy, but my father was supportive. He said, "If you want to do it, you should do it." Thanks to her outstanding grades in college, Gadish managed to get accepted at Harvard, and even got a scholarship to pay for it. It was much needed because inflation in Israel was sky high, and I couldn't get a loan for my studies. After the initial excitement, however, reality kicked in. Despite her stellar academic background, the Hebrew-speaking Gadish could barely speak English, and her knowledge of American culture was close to zero. At first, I could hardly say hi, hello, or how are you, she said. I certainly couldn't have a conversation about politics, and I took hours to read a text. But the hardest thing, she said, was not knowing about the American culture. I had never been to a supermarket. I had never eaten cereals in my life. And I didn't know who Johnny Carson was. That was a problem for her because, as she explained, HBS, Harvard Business School, is all about case studies, and one of the first ones was about whether or not Kellogg's should add another cereal to its offering. So I started to go to the supermarket with a friend, where we looked in the aisles to find out about what Americans were eating, and went to a friend's apartment to watch television. It was all very overwhelming. We had to study at least 3 cases per week, she said. With my level of English, I had to translate every word at first. It was hard. Take the word contribution. It didn't mean what I thought. It took me 6 hours instead of 1 hour just to read the case. In class, I couldn't express myself. In my 3rd day, I remember I was looking at a particularly long case. It was midnight, and I hadn't even finished reading the case. I said, I can't do it. For Gadish, it was an exercise in perseverance, in believing in herself despite the challenges, and in keeping the right perspective. That night, I decided to just go to sleep. I woke up the next morning, and I thought, I never quit anything in my life. So I shouldn't quit this. I should read the important cases, and do so until I master them. She made a plan, and stuck it out. I went to talk to professors, and I joined a study group, which was encouraging. I decided that I wasn't going to be shy about asking things if I didn't understand them. In such cases, the motivation can come from simple human interactions and small encouragements. There was one guy who thought it was hysterical, Gadish said. I was a woman, I was Israeli, and I didn't speak English. So I asked him if he would be willing to help me. And he did. But the slow learning process continued to cause challenges, and overcoming them wasn't easy. One professor gave Gadish 3 cases to choose from for her exam, each consisting of 40 pages of text. Could you tell me which one to focus on? She asked, worried. If you have no background in economics, why don't you just fail the course? Her professor retorted, and added, I like to see long answers. Gadish was shocked. I wasn't mad at him, but I was upset. After all, I was studying to become a professor, just like him. But she tried her best. I spent 3 hours and 40 minutes reading the case. I knew I could never finish answering. So during the remaining time, I wrote, here's what I would have done. I would make these analyses. I would think of these 2 options. And here's what I would choose. Much to her surprise, after the test, Gadish got summoned to her professor's office and received good news. He had given her an excellent. You actually spent time thinking about options, instead of going straight into the case, he explained. In the end, Gadish said, I spent a lot of time getting to know the language, the culture, and the business. But it was all very exciting. By the time she finished her MBA, in May 1977, she was in the top 5% of her graduating class, and got the prize for Most Outstanding Marketing Student. But the next challenge was already on the horizon. Having finished her MBA 2 years into her 4-year doctorate program, Gadish realized she didn't want to remain in academics. In May, I decided when everyone had a job already that I didn't want to teach. I wanted to practice. I made up my mind, but no recruiters were coming to campus anymore. I wanted to do either of two things, retail or consulting. I was interested in retail, because my father's family had a history in it, and I applied directly to Macy's and Bloomingdale's, after they already accepted everyone. I got an offer from both of them, but after consideration, I turned them down. The reason was a new, up-and-coming consulting firm that had gotten Gadiish's attention, Bain & Company, founded just 4 years earlier, in 1973. Having learned to love to crack cases at HBS, Gadiish decided she was set for a career in consulting, rather than one at a large company. It was a decision she shared with many business school graduates at the time. I was interested in consulting because it was thinking about problems and solving them, she said. The most obvious choice would have been McKinsey & Co., the longtime industry leader, or Boston Consulting Group, a strong Boston-based competitor. But a new kid on the block was making strides, Bain. Founded by Bill Bain, a former BCG vice president from Tennessee, Bain & Co. worked in ways that were unconventional for the industry at the time. It would accept only one client per industry, would report directly to the CEO, and would take stakes or other variable success fees to show its commitment to getting results, not reports. Most importantly, it would not limit itself to consultation, but help the companies it worked for in the implementation of their advice. Gadiish was sold on the concept. I was very taken by Bill Bain's idea of implementation. Plus, it was smallest of the consultants, and it was in Boston as well. The decision was made quickly. Bain offered Gadiish an interesting position, and instead of staying at Harvard, she accepted the position at Bain. In that small, fast-growing company there were only 2 offices. The young Israeli consultant was soaked in knowledge all the time. She traveled the country for the first time and appreciated being put even in the oddest of situations. One time, she said, I went to visit pig farmers, maybe about 100 of them. I went into their homes, interviewed them, and loved it. I really went all over the country, and saw and learned all kinds of things. That intellectual curiosity, she said, was a gift. Her curiosity wasn't always reciprocated though, and sometimes, the young Israeli woman was even frowned upon. One of her first assignments was in a steel company, a male-dominated industry. She told me of her experience there, a story he had previously shared with Sheryl Sandberg. Too, there were no women in the steel. It was a test of some sorts, Gadiish assumed, because it felt as if Bill Bain threw a ball at me and asked, "Can you take it? Or is it too big for you?" And I would answer, "Sure, I'll take it." After all, I did want to work in the steel industry. I wanted to climb up the coal oven and see what was happening. She got a chilling welcome. Women are bad luck in our industry, the CFO of the company said to Gadiish, as she was meeting with management in preparation for some competitor visitors. It was outright offending. Was she supposed to get mad? No, Gadiish said. When someone says something like that, the last thing you can do is be upset. These were his beliefs, it was not about me. My job as a consultant was to make him comfortable. So rather than pick up a fight, she thought about something her father often used, humor. He had a great sense of humor, she said. He showed me that the power of humor is a very important part of life, just like it is very important to be able to laugh at yourself. Well, if I'm bad luck, she finally retorted, I think you should make sure I join the team on every single one of the competitor visits. Everyone started to laugh, and the ice was broken. It wasn't just the outside world that fed her intellectual curiosity. Her colleagues did, too. In the same year, Bill Bain, the company's founder, recruited another young consultant to his Boston offices. This young man had graduated just 2 years earlier than Gadish from Harvard Business School and had started his own consulting career at BCG, where he caught the attention of many colleagues because of his talent and appearance. His name, Mitt Romney. Chapter 5, Lansing, Michigan, 1977. Around the time Orrick Gadish and Mitt Romney started working for Bain, David Kenney, the son of a janitor and a payroll clerk, had to start thinking about an equally important choice for his future. Would he become the first person in his family to go to college? Kenney was born in 1961 in Lansing, Michigan, a town of farming, automotive industry, and state politics, as he said himself. It was a time of major changes in America. There was the media revolution. Around the time Kenney was a toddler, for the first time, more than 50% of households had a TV, and in 1960 for the United States switched to color television. There was the science and technology revolution. In 1969, the 8-year-old Kenney saw Neil Armstrong land on the moon as first man in the Earth's history. And then there was the car revolution. Throughout Kenney's youth, American families grew richer, got more modern equipment, and started riding and owning cars. Nowhere was that more felt than in Michigan, the heart of America's car industry. For the young Kenney, those changes would prove to be extremely impactful on a personal level. When I met him in Dubai, at the end of 2014, he had already worked 3 years as the CEO of a major television channel, the Weather Channel, which specializes in translating weather science into TV programs. He also told me of his early career at General Motors, one of America's driving forces of the car revolution. And around the time I wrote this book, Kenney was appointed head of IBM's Watson project, an artificial intelligence project that in scale and ambition reminded me of the mission to go to the moon back in the 1950s and 1960s. However, going to college wasn't immediately an obvious choice for Kenney. We had a nice life at home, with both of my parents bringing in a salary, but it wasn't considered necessary I go to college, he said. So, whether at elementary school or high school, college wasn't a must. I went to a public high school, and maybe 10% went on to college. It wasn't guided that way. Besides, other Lansing public high school students at the time found other ways to success. A boy 2 years Kenney's senior, Irvin Johnson, started making headlines in local newspapers for leading the Lansing Public Everett High School to the state title in basketball and being named to the 1977 McDonald's All-American team. Later, he would go to Michigan State, and even later, he'd become world famous as a Los Angeles Lakers star in the NBA and a member of the USA Dream Team in the Barcelona Olympics. Most people now know him as Magic Johnson. Nonetheless, Kenney said, it seemed interesting to go to college and learn more about science. I got fascinated by the moon landing, and so did my dad. I thought a college science education could open new doors. And luckily, I had a practical way to get there. I looked at scholarships in state schools, but didn't get them. But I also did a science project, and Tom Shields, an HR scout who worked for General Motors, discovered me through that. He came to visit me in high school, took a real interest, and drove me to GM. At the end of the 1970s, General Motors was facing a major macroeconomic shock, which threatened to end what was eventually the longest and biggest growth phase of its history. In Iran, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi fled his country after heavy protests, and the anti-American Ayatollah Khamenei took over power, fueling what would be known as the 1979 energy crisis. Oil prices in the United States skyrocketed, and the car industry was directly and adversely affected. Still, GM needed new talent, and to funnel young professionals into their company, it had set up the GM Institute in Flint, Michigan, now Kettering University, before the war, a co-op school that combined college education and work experience at GM's original Flint facilities. They aimed for students like me, Kenny said, smart, eager, but not necessarily with the means to go to college. I had a grade average and high SAT scores. I had other schools I was accepted to, like the University of Michigan and Michigan State, but I had no way to pay for it. Kenny got accepted at GMI with a full scholarship and even a small salary, together with a host of other students. One student he specifically spoke to me about was Mary Michaela. She was really passionate about GM, he said. She was a typical product person. She studied electrical engineering, later got a master's degree from Stanford, and spent her whole career at GM. When she got married, she changed her name to that of her husband, and in December 2013, she was appointed by General Motors as the first female CEO in the automotive industry. Her married name is Mary Barra. Like Barra, Kenny did so well at GM that upon graduating from GMI in 1984, he got selected for the GM Fellowship, allowing him to pursue a master's degree at Harvard Business School. This time, the U.S. economy was again in full swing and oil prices had gone back to normal. The 1980s were also the time of Reagan and his Reagan boom of deregulation in the financial sector, and the rise of the bankers and consultants as new business stars, something Kenny realized at Harvard. Going to business school was a huge eye-opener, he said. The most interesting part was not what I learned, but who else was in the class, people from banking, consulting, all top of their game. I got exposed to many different backgrounds and careers. But I didn't go to any interviews, because I would go back to GM. In 1986, when Kenny graduated from HBS, he went back to GM and resumed his work in the company. But the excitement of business school had disappeared. I became a bit bored at GM. It was constantly reducing and cutting, it had big economic challenges. And I looked ahead to say, if I work really hard, I might run a division, or become the CEO. But it didn't look as interesting anymore. His fascination for consultants, on the other hand, didn't go away. In the spring of 1987, less than a year after he had returned from Boston to Michigan, Kenny decided it was time to make a move. That April, Fortune magazine published a feature story that would long be remembered among consultants. Its title was Bain, a consulting firm too hot to handle? The story looked closely at some of the benefits and pitfalls of the consulting firm's famously aggressive business approach. It painted an ambiguous picture of the company's founder and CEO, Bill Bain, and questioned the company's practice of working so intimately with its client CEOs that it seemed as though the Bain consultants were in charge. While the story received mixed reviews within Bain, it prompted Kenny to join the mysterious, powerful consulting firm. When I went into consulting, too hot to handle was the cover story on Bain, said Kenny. It was bold back then. But Bain was in trouble, too, and Kenny didn't know that he was simply looking for the best cultural fit. I knew another consulting firm, too, McKinsey. They were a little more prestigious, and they worked for GM. But they looked a little elite, and that was not my background. Bain seemed more like a good fit for Kenny. The dice had been thrown. Kenny joined Bain in the summer of 1987. Unfortunately for Kenny, less than a year later, the company almost went under. Chapter 6, Boston, 1988. How exactly Bain got into trouble has been documented extensively. In short, three factors came together in a perfect storm. First, Bain's one client per industry backfired, just as the company bet on expansion by hiring more people and opening more offices. Second, competitors like McKinsey and BCG started copying Bain's unique client approach, further threatening its revenues. And third, the fact that Bain's structure and shares were still largely controlled by its founders began causing internal struggles. In response, Bain & Company was formally incorporated as a partnership. As partners began to trade out their shares for money, Bain was facing an increasingly large debt, which began to hang as a millstone around the firm's neck, as its revenues came under further pressure. It was in this environment that Kenny and Gatish, both with their different backgrounds and history at the company, had to face the most important choice of their careers: should they stay or should they go? Gatish, who had been with the firm for 10 years, knew what was coming. What Bain came up with was revolutionary. It was a terrific company that was still true, she said. But the investment bankers told us we were not going to be able to make it. The owners had taken too much money out of the company. Even so, Gatish thought the values and principles were worthwhile. There was a belief in what we were doing, she said. And that belief was independent from the cash that did or did not remain. Kenny, on the other hand, was taken by surprise. I joined Bain as a consultant, and 6 months later, the company went through a restructuring, and people got laid off. In the hectic years that followed, Kenny started to work for clients under Gatish directly, and both were rewarded for their results, though their future remained uncertain. Gatish, a senior partner and a crucial part of the company's new leadership, while Kenny, under Gatish's leadership, got promoted to manager and then partner. As Bain went through its near-death experience, Gatish found herself in the middle of the storm. By the end of 1990, the company was still around, and so were Gatish and Kenny, but due to the debts that remained, its forecasts were increasingly grim. In a final effort to save the company, the senior leadership at Bain asked Mitt Romney, the former Bain-turned private equity investor, to return and become CEO. Romney obliged. Announced as its new CEO in January 1991, Romney oversaw an effort to restructure Bain & Company's employee stock ownership plan, and put in place a new governing structure that increased fiscal transparency and ownership. He got Bain and other initial owners who had removed excessive amounts of money from the firm to return a substantial amount, and persuaded creditors, including the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to accept less than full payment. This was a turning point, not just for the company, but for all three people. To put it in the military terms Gatish previously described, Commander-in-Chief Romney set out the turnaround strategy from the bunker, Gatish led the troops from the front, and Kenny was a loyal lieutenant on the ground. When Mitt took over, he decided we would focus on the big clients, Kenny said. Since I was working for the biggest of them all, a financial services client, Mitt paid attention to me. We met several times, and he always said, just focus on the clients. Don't pay attention to the restructuring. Focus on the clients and your team. That was exactly what Gatish did too, focus on the clients. After the partner we met at the beginning of this chapter walked in Gatish's office to ask her whether he should accept an outside offer, Gatish decided it was time for her to lead by example. I called headhunters and said, I don't want to get calls anymore. I want to stay for at least 2 years. The next time the partner came into her office, Gatish said, "See, not everyone is talking to headhunters. I am not. Now do me a favor and say to people that you decided to stay as well. Tell people the whole story of what we did." Gatish's plan worked. More people came over to her and asked, "Are you really not talking to headhunters?" She said yes, and found it liberating. That type of leadership really contributed, Gatish said. We kept our focus on the clients, and after I stopped talking to headhunters, people realized that helped. By 1992, the skies started clearing up again, and the financial mist disappeared. Romney, who had remained a partner at Bain Capital all along, decided to return to his private equity position and hand over leadership of the company to 2 successors. As chairman, he chose the woman who had been so instrumental in helping him succeed the turnaround, Orit Gatish. As a symbol of the new Bain & Company, Gatish chose a compass that pointed to the company's true north, its clients. "When it's foggy and you can't see, you have to know where true north is," said Kenny. For us at Bain, it was our clients, not our money. He told me Gatish had learned that lesson from her husband, who was a sailor. Gatish largely confirmed Kenny's story. "Have you heard of True North, Peter?" she asked me at the end of our conversation. I nodded. "I coined that concept," she continued, "so we remind ourselves always about what we went through." Chapter 7, Lessons Learned. Many of the people I spoke to for this book started their careers at similar firms, management consulting firms, large accounting firms, or large multinational companies of some kind. It's an obvious career choice, as these companies are often most aggressively recruiting on campus. I experienced that myself, having started my own career at Bain without really having given other companies any serious thought. But there is a deeper advantage to this. The CEOs I spoke to told me time again that this type of career start enables you to learn the basics of being a professional in a very well-structured way and gain a toolbox of skill sets that you can apply throughout your career. And it's a two-way street. These companies have an interest in attracting young graduates, as they can make use of their eagerness and enthusiasm to learn and do well. They can mold young graduates in their corporate culture, so they can either become the next leaders of the company or its biggest supporters. Orit Gatish and David Kenny are 2 cases in point. Orit Gatish stayed at Bain her whole career, while David Kenny went the other direction. He left Bain, becoming CEO at several other firms. But as their experiences show, the toughest moments they lived through at Bain were among the most teachable moments for the rest of their careers. The following sections summarize the key points you can take away from Kenny and Gatish's story, and that you can apply in your own career. Follow your gut instinct, not money or fame. For both Gatish and Kenny, working for Bain was one of several options they had. They didn't choose Bain solely for the money or the career prospects, but because they loved what it stood for. Kenny had a good job at GM, and could have stayed there his whole career if he wanted to. Consider again what he said. "I looked ahead and said to myself, if I work really hard, I might run a division, or become the CEO of GM. But that didn't look interesting." That he could have become CEO were not vain words. As a matter of fact, he did become CEO of several listed global companies in the end, Digitas and the Weather Company. And as you have read, his classmate at the GM Institute, Mary Barra, did in fact become CEO of GM. Regarding that, he said, "It's the first time in the history that GM is run by a product person." You need a passion for the product. I'm happy for her. But as for Kenny himself, by the time he applied for Bain, he was consumed by the idea of working in different industries and different countries, and thought it was much more exciting than continuing to work for GM. As for Gadish, she could have become a professor at Hebrew University in her home country, as she had wanted to at first, or she could have become a professional in the retail industry, as her family had done before her. Again, the options were very real and attainable. She even had to go out of her way to get to what she really wanted, namely, to work for Bain. The lesson learned is that if you really know what you want, you should develop a sort of tunnel vision, and go for it. If that means saying no to other offers, so be it. It is certainly better than the alternative, whereby you go for other people's preferred choices rather than your own. Gadish put her feelings about this philosophy in the following way: I never had the target of becoming CEO. When I started at Bain, all my peers wanted to know how long it would take to be a partner. I just wanted to be the best consultant. And I wanted to be good at what I did. Within each job, it was important for me to evolve, and that hasn't changed even today as chairman. In our company, you don't need to get a new title to perform a new role. In short, you should always follow your gut instinct when making a choice about your future. When you're contemplating a change, ask yourself whether or not you still enjoy what you're currently doing. Find your true north. We all have moments in our careers when we face uncertainty or adversity. For Kenny and Gadish, the moment of greatest uncertainty came when the company they both worked for, and which in a way represented their professional dreams, threatened to go under. Neither of them knew whether the company would survive, nor whether they themselves would survive at the company. But even though the view was foggy, as Kenny said, they did soldier on, and in the end came out of the mist, together with their company. The most important reason, they both told me, is that they knew what their true north was, the direction they had to follow. In their case, true north was servicing the clients of the company. It was the belief that what they did was unique, and that it was valuable for their clients. So that's what they had to keep doing. They knew they were on a solid ship, they knew they were skillful sailors, and they knew that if they kept going in the right direction, they would get into quiet waters again. For others, true north may mean a different thing than servicing the client, but it will always involve your answers to questions like, what is it exactly that I am trying to do? Why am I doing it? Am I good at it? And does it have value for others? If you know the answers to these questions, and those answers intuitively make sense, you probably found your true north and you are likely to regain focus and continue to do what you're doing despite external destabilizing factors. Know when to persevere and when to change course. Finding true north is a necessary condition to succeed, but it is not enough. It will help you regain clarity when you're not sure whether you should stay or you should go. But then, it's still up to you to bite the bullet or give up. That is the final lesson from the near-death experience of Gadish and Kenny at Bain. That doesn't mean that you should never quit, or that quitting is for losers, as the known mantra describes. As a matter of fact, as we have seen, both Gadish and Kenny quit a professional duty at least once in their careers, Gadish when she dropped out of her PhD program, and Kenny when he dropped out of the GM Institute program. Quitting or persevering is thus not the point in itself, it's the reason behind it that matters. If you are convinced you should quit, as Gadish was when she dropped out of her PhD program, then you should do so. Or if you are convinced you should hold on, as Gadish was when she stopped talking to headhunters for 2 years, then you should do that instead. It's only when you know what to do but don't do it that you are really a quitter and will fail. Next time you quit because you think it's the right thing to do, give yourself a pat on the shoulder. And next time you persevere even though you're going through a rough time, also give yourself a pat on the shoulder. In both cases, you're doing the right thing. That's what Gatish and Kenny tell us through their stories. Chapter 8 Endnotes. Coincidentally, 1 year earlier, BCG hired a fellow Israeli that came to the United States for his studies, Benjamin Netanyahu, now Prime Minister of Israel. The story of Orit Gatish to which this makes reference appears on the Lean In website of Sheryl Sandberg. It accompanies her book Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead, Knopf, 2013. Read more at http://leanin.org/stories/Orit Gatish/. The term Reagan boom was referred to, amongst others, in 1990 in the New York Times opinion article The Reagan Boom, The Greatest Ever? http://www. New York Times. com/1990/01/17/opinion/The Reagan Boom Greatest Ever. HTML. Bain, a consulting firm too hot to handle? Fortune, 1987, http://fortune.com/2012/01/15/Bain, a consulting firm too hot to handle. Fortune 1987/. For more information, see Mariam Nafisi, The Fast Track, Crown Business, 1997. Jack Sweeney, Raising Bain, Consulting Magazine, 2001. Tim Dickinson, The Federal Bailout That Saved Mitt Romney, Rolling Stone, August 29, 2012. Underscore 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 You can read more about this turnaround plan in Tim Dickinson's Rolling Stone article, The Federal Bailout That Saved Mitt Romney, August 29, 2012, and Matthew Rees's The American article, Mr. PowerPoint Goes to Washington, December 1, 2006. Both give interesting details about what happened at Bain during Romney's tenure as CEO, though their primary objective is to speak about Romney as a politician. Chapter 2 The Dot-Com Crisis. The stories of David Kenny, Chris Gopalakrishnan, and Raf Kustermans. Chapter 9 New York, March 2000. People in the tech world were still partying like it was 1999. The Internet revolution had people from Silicon Valley to Wall Street and far beyond dreaming of a world where the new technology stood front and center, and Internet entrepreneurs were the new billionaires. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. In less than 5 years, shares in the technology stock index Nasdaq grew by more than 500%. On March 10, 2000, it hit an all-time high of 5 points. But that was all about to end. For some companies, like Chris Gopalakrishnan's Infosys, the dot-com era meant a breakthrough after decades of hard work. The IT outsourcing company was founded by 7 engineers in 1981, and it took them 23 years to make their first $1 billion in revenues. But it took only another 2 years to make the second billion, and only a year for the third billion. On the back of those successes, the company's U.S.-listed stocks exploded in value, from a little more than $1 in March 1999 to just under $21 in March 2000, a 15-fold increase. The same was true for Digitas, an advertising company that was created in the early 80s, but that had morphed into a digital advertising agency in the mid-90s. On March 14, 2000, it was the last company to go public in the Internet era. The man who led the initial public offering was someone you were introduced to in Chapter 1, former Bain David Kenny. He had left Bain after 10 years to be part of the nascent Internet boom, and had become CEO of Digitas in 1997. The IPO made him an instant multimillionaire on paper and valued his company at more than $1 billion. For other people, the Internet boom led to more pragmatic and improvised ventures. Such was the case for Raf Kustermans, a neighborhood friend of mine in Lier, Belgium. We had always played soccer together on the pitch nearby, where he had become known as the Ginger One because of his long, unkempt red haircut. When I was in high school, Raf was starting out as an internet entrepreneur, setting up, among other things, an online jokes site and a chat network, after dropping out of college in his first year. He had gotten $25,000 in seed money from another neighborhood friend's uncle. "Why don't you set up a regional news site for me?" Raf asked me one day in the summer of 2000, after listening to an online radio program a friend of mine and I were hosting called Studio 17, a wink to Studio 54, with 17 being the street number of my friend's house. "It's going to be the newest trend online, and we can be the first ones in the game," he said. The summer break was just about to start, so I had no reason to say no. By the end of the summer break, we had a functioning beta site and were excited to move the project forward. But the project didn't go forward. Instead, the Internet hype came to an abrupt end. On the stock exchange, the dot-com bubble burst, and when the tragic events of 9/11 occurred in 2001, Internet was over for good. In Europe, Raf's Internet company dwindled. Over in New York, the shares of David Kenny's Digitas came crashing down from a share price of about $25 at its introduction to 88 cents by October 2001, representing less than $40 million in residual valuation. In India, Chris Gopalakrishnan and his fellow co-founders saw their Nasdaq valuation go down by the billions as well, as their stock price fell from $21 in 2000 to just 1/10 of that right after September 11. Gopalakrishnan saw his work of 20 years literally decimated, and Kustermans was left with no college degree, no money, and a company worth next to nothing. As for Kenny, he saw his virtual riches vanish in thin air and faced imminent bankruptcy, while at home he and his wife had 2 young girls to raise. What were these 3 men supposed to do next? In the last chapter, we saw how future leaders dealt with tough choices in uncertain times, and how they found the strength to persevere, or the courage to quit. In this chapter, we turn to other, almost inevitable types of events. What do you do when, like Raf Kustermans, what you've worked for over a number of years turns out to be worth next to nothing? What do you do when, like David Kenny, you're going through a really tough time just to keep a company afloat? Or what do you do when, like Chris Gopalakrishnan, your work of 20 years is decimated? As we'll learn from their accounts, those moments, though extremely challenging when they take place, can be the seed for success as well as modesty later on. When I spoke to Raf, David, and Chris almost a decade and a half after the dot-com bubble burst, they could remember the episode with a smile. The Nasdaq had returned to record levels in 2015. Kustermans ended up in London, founded a social gaming company, and early in 2016, sold it to a competitor, earning his investors several million pounds. Kenny had stuck it out at Digitas and managed after a few years to sell the company to advertising giant Publicis. When we first met, he was the CEO of The Weather Company, the largest TV and internet company for weather services globally. In 2016, He sold the weather company's digital arm to computer giant IBM, and became head of its renowned Watson computer project. Meanwhile, Chris and his fellow co-founders all remained at Infosys, and continued to build the company despite its stock market tumble. But the things that these three men experienced during the wondrous year 2000 and its terrible aftermath have stuck with them. So how did they get to play a part in the 2000 tech bubble? How did they overcome its adversity? And what lessons can we draw from it? Chapter 10, Kerala, India, 1955. Located on the southwestern coast of mainland India, and surrounded by green hills, Trivandrum was nicknamed the Evergreen City of India by Mahatma Gandhi. But all wasn't rosy. India had gained independence from Britain just 7 years before Chris was born, and its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, struggled to find an adequate economic recipe for the nation. In Nehru's almost 2 decades in office, India steered a protectionist and centralist economic course, leading to what would later be known as the Hindu rate of growth, a per capita growth rate far below that of other Asian nations, such as South Korea and Taiwan. It was against this backdrop of a nascent, struggling nation that Chris grew up in the 1960s. He went to a public high school in Trivandrum, the government model high school, and prepared to enter medical school following his parents' wishes, despite his own preference for engineering. Although he went into the entry exam confident that he would pass it, Gopalakrishnan scored just 2 points below the minimum to get accepted. To make matters worse, he hadn't signed up for any engineering school as a backup plan, being so certain he would get into med school. Clueless about what to do next, the young Chris saw his self-confidence tank, Gopalakrishnan told me in 2014, as he recounted the turning points in his life. Seated in a white egg-shaped plastic chair in the Davos Congress Center, 58-year-old Gopalakrishnan, now silver-haired and wearing his signature mustache, wouldn't talk about the internet crash of 2000-2001, when he saw billions of dollars vanish into thin air. Apparently, the med school incident had been more impactful. "It took me 3 years to get my confidence back," he said. In those 3 years, Gopalakrishnan studied physics at a local college in Kerala, and slowly got back on his feet. He eventually regained his self-confidence, thanks in large part to his math teacher at that time, C. Philip. "He saw me and believed in me when I did not," Gopalakrishnan said. "He told me to try again, this time with his help." It was the push the young man needed. After 3 years at the local college, he applied again for a more prestigious school, the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras, and passed the written engineering entrance exam. Passing that hurdle was a turning point to rebuild confidence, Gopalakrishnan said. "It showed me that I have what it takes to succeed. It confirmed to me that I had the ingredients for success all along." Surprisingly, at the end of the application process, Chris faced the same situation. Although he passed the written exam, he failed the oral interview because of his limited knowledge of the English language, and wasn't admitted to the university of his choice. But it didn't matter as much to him this time. He carved out a plan B in the master's degree program in physics at IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology. Those studies may still not have been his preferred choice, Gopalakrishnan explained, but they did open the door to co-founding one of the biggest Indian companies of our time, Infosys. "Looking back, chance, coincidence, and luck played an important role," he said. "It's difficult to anticipate the future 35 years back. I could never imagine to be where I am now." So what triggered his future? "When I was working on my master's in physics, I took an optional course in computer programming, Gopalakrishnan said. I got passionate about it and switched to computer science. It was pure chance. I did not say, this is where I need to have the big breakthrough. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. He certainly was. Gopalakrishnan started studying computer science in 1977, the same year that Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne founded Apple. He was working in his first job, at Patni Computer Systems, in 1980, when Bill Gates won the IBM contract that led to the development of MS-DOS, and eventually, Microsoft Windows. 1 year later, in 1981, Chris and 6 others left Patni to found an IT company of their own, Infosys. When we started, many of our classmates had migrated mostly to the United States, Gopalakrishnan explained. But we said, hey, here are some of us that want to stay in India, let's build a business here. Having no savings or family funding, the 7 registered their company with only 10,000 rupees in capital, or about $250, and rented a house in Pune from which to run their company. It was all very Apple-like, Gopalakrishnan said. We would share rooms, sometimes even tables. We would also get a loan and a license for our first computer, the only computer we had. We would lease it out during the daytime, and use it ourselves during the night time to save costs. In that first year, Infosys hired 3 people, mostly because of a contract it got with its first client, Data Basics Corporation in the United States. That made the company profitable from the start as well. But revenue growth was slow, and so was that of their own income. The founders of Infosys, with Chris Gopalakrishnan, in the early 1980s when Gopalakrishnans told me of the next turning point, it became clear that we had a fundamentally different perspective on the importance of time in building your career. I always assumed that time was of critical importance if I wanted to become successful, that I had no time to lose. I feared that if I missed the boat of a fast-track career early on, I could not become a senior executive later. Chris's story made it clear to me that this was a wrong way of thinking. He skipped almost 10 years in recounting the turning points in his career. The first 10 years of Infosys was about survival, Gopalakrishnan said. It was about making enough money to get around and grow slowly. We cared more about doing things right than about doing things fast. I couldn't imagine spending the first 10 to 15 years of my career not thinking about the next step, but he clearly did. By 1989, he said, we still had nothing to show. Our revenues were $1 million, and we were with about 40 to 50 people working in the company. Simply put, this equates to $20,000, $25,000 in revenues per employee, or calculated in a different way, $150,000 in revenues per founder, before paying all overhead costs such as salaries. We talked to our former classmates, and by now, they all had a car and house. We, on the other hand, had nothing of that. We were 10 years out of university, and we lived in modest apartments. India as a whole wasn't doing too great either. By 1985, India was starting to have balance of payment problems. By 1990, it was in an economic crisis. Around that time, the Infosys co-founders got an offer to be bought out. It caused some serious doubts. Many said, maybe we should sell and go, Gopalakrishnan recalled. But our chairman, Narayan Murthy, told us he'd buy us out and continue on his own if he had to. That was the turning point. Once he had said that, we decided to stay together and continue. We told ourselves to aim for an IPO in 3 years, and scale up the business significantly from there. And that's how it all worked out. Considering the macroeconomic environment of India at the time, it's easier to understand why Gopalakrishnan is such a believer in being at the right place at the right time. In 1991, 45 years after India regained its independence, and after the same number of years of Hindu years of growth, the country's leaders finally decided the time had come to open up to the world. In a series of liberalizations, India moved toward more of a market economy, away from the centralization initiated by Nehru in the 1950s, and opened up its capital markets for foreign investors. It paved the way for Infosys as well. In February 1993, effectively 4 years after its founders had decided to resist a private buyout, the company went public and sold its shares at 95 rupees apiece, which was 75 rupees higher than the book value. The IPO made all of the founders millionaires, and gave them redemption for the more than 10 years in which they had nothing to show. But the IPO was just the beginning. The founders took all the money from the IPO and invested it back into the business instead of cashing it in. That, together with the dot-com boom, which by the mid-1990s started to really gain steam, led to a period of exponential growth. The Internet bubble created a huge demand for software services, Gopalakrishnan recalled. We grew by 100% or more every year. It wasn't just their revenues, which doubled every year, their stock value followed suit. By 1994, the stock price had surged to 450 rupees. By March 1999, when the company started trading on the Indian Stock Exchange as well as on Nasdaq, the stock traded at more than 3,000 rupees in India, and opened at around $1 in New York. A year later, as the Nasdaq reached its zenith, the U.S.-listed stocks exploded to almost $21, whereas on the Indian exchange, the share had peaked earlier that year at 16,855 rupees per share, more than the entire starting capital of the company in 1981. Infosys was one of the 20 largest companies listed on the Nasdaq, and Gopalakrishnan was a billionaire. Chapter 11, Boston, 1997. At the same time that Infosys was going through its astronomical growth phase, direct marketing firm Digitas was reinventing itself online to capture its own share of the dot-com boom. To guide the company through that bold strategic shift, it counted on a man you were introduced to previously, David Kenny. Could the General Motors manager turned management consultant morph into an Internet CEO next? What happened? Internet happened. Kenny replied when I asked him what triggered his switch to Digitas in 1997. AOL started, Yahoo, Minitel in France, and I thought, if this takes off, this will be huge. More specifically, in 1995, Kenny met Jerry Yang, who was CEO of Yahoo at that time. Yahoo had only about 100 employees then, but it was already a fast-growing company. I made the decision to switch to the Internet industry a year later, Kenny said. I had an idea in my head that the Internet would really help say for each person what was interesting for them. Now, we know this as retargeting. While Yang and others were already starting to discover the Internet, most marketing firms were still focused on the real world. That was the case for Michael Bronner, the founder of Digitas. Kenny, who knew Bronner from a previous consulting assignment, saw an opportunity. One night, Bronner and Kenny had dinner in Boston, and talked about how the Internet could change everything, which might require some fresh impetus in the company. It turned out to be a turning point. The next day, Kenny recounted, Bronner called me and said I was right about the need to delegate, and about embracing the internet more. "You need to come in and run the company," he said, and literally for months, I told him I wasn't sure. But he was determined I run the company, and in the end, we struck a deal. Having been a Bain partner for 10 years, this was a lot for Kenny to give up, especially after all he had been through with the company. "People had called me before for other jobs," Kenny said, "but those jobs hadn't been interesting. Now, however, he was ready for it. My risk profile was right." In order to understand where Kenny was at this point in his life, let's take a pause to explore what exactly a risk profile is and how it can be right for different job changes throughout your career. When we start our careers, switching from one job to another doesn't carry a lot of risk. After all, when you're young, and you have neither a work history nor a family, there's nothing much to lose. Such was the case for Kenny when he switched from GM to Bain. It was a great opportunity period. After about 5 to 7 years, things start to change for many people. By the time you're in your late 20s or early 30s, chances are you're getting married and starting a family, which might not seem like a great moment to make big career changes. It's often after you're settled in your family life and you have solid finances that career changes surface again. In a way, David Kenny was no exception. Having married right after business school, their first daughter was born in 1993, and their second one in 1996. "Right when we got children, I couldn't just go and be an entrepreneur," Kenny said. "You sense a different level of responsibility." But by 1997, having been a partner at Bain for several years, and with his wife having worked in venture capital, the financial outlook for Kenny and his family was positive, and their personal life was in balance. They had paid off their mortgage and had saved money for the children to go to college. Kenny and his wife deemed the time right to make a career move. "I didn't feel it was irresponsible, because we didn't have a mortgage and saved money. We lived rather conservatively. That was crucial. I never had to make a decision based on the financial aspect of it. I could make it based on what I love." Moving out of consulting would also allow Kenny to feed his intellectual curiosity. Despite the hands-on approach of Bain, sitting in the driver's seat as CEO would still be a different experience. "I figured that after having done Bain for 10 years, I won't learn as much in the future as I did in the last 10 years. Kenny also believed that he would be home more often than when he was a consultant, which had involved a lot of travel, although that prediction didn't actually materialize. Kenny negotiated a deal with Bronner about his salary and stock, and he and his wife decided that he would take the CEO job while his wife would stop working and take charge of their family life. "It only worked because it was a team decision," Kenny said. "It certainly helped to have a stable family, and my wife is a large factor in my success. She ran the finances, she ran our investments, and she ran the household. That made life manageable. It was a real division of labor, and it worked, because we both loved it." In the following years, Kenny had a great time, because we really did figure out retargeting with Digitas. The pinnacle came on March 14, 2000, when Digitas went to the stock exchange. "The Nasdaq was at 5012, I'll never forget it," said Kenny. "The company was valued at $1 billion. That's the richest I've ever been." Chapter 12, Lier, Belgium, 2000. As Gopalakrishnan and Kenny were counting their riches, Raf Kustermans was among those attracted by the success stories and wanting a piece of it. For years earlier, at age 16, he had made his first entrepreneurial steps by organizing parties at the local church's events hall with 2 other neighborhood friends, earning about $500 per party. In the years that followed, he and his pals went on to organize ever larger parties for up to 1,500 people at the largest event hall in Lier, the Belgian town about 35 miles from Brussels that we both lived in, which had a population of about 30,000 at the time. It was exciting and new for Kustermans, who didn't come from a family of entrepreneurs, but unnerving for his parents, who would have preferred it if their son took a safe summer job at a local hamburger restaurant. For Kustermans, it was only the beginning. "We felt on top of the world," he said. Organizing that first party was about making money and having people look up to us. By the time he graduated from high school, Kustermans had more than half a dozen parties under his belt, some of which had been successes, others of which had been failures, but all of which had him longing for more. Those first successes, those people who look at you as the man in charge, the reputation you get and the ego boost that stems from it's all very appealing, and makes you want to experience more of the same, Kustermans said. Once he was in college, studying political science and mass communications, Kustermans couldn't be bothered by the academic approach of his professors, and the many hours spent in classrooms and study rooms, without getting a taste of what the classes would mean in real life. He passed only about half of his exams, deferring the others to the summer, and then failed half of those as well. It wasn't ideal, Kustermans told me when we caught up over the phone 15 years later. I was quickly distracted, wasn't very feeling 100% at my place, and didn't think much of most of my classmates either. After a year, Kustermans decided to give real life a chance and went looking for a job. The mother of a mutual friend of ours arranged for an unpaid internship for him in the media world, and then Kustermans quit college and joined an Antwerp-based advertising agency full-time. Being by far the youngest person at the agency, Kustermans got assigned to the online campaigns. Online was still a very small business in Europe, but as we saw with Kenny, it was a very promising business elsewhere. "Obviously, I wasn't going to be an account director anytime soon," he said, "but because I was the youngest of the team, it seemed to make natural sense to put me on the internet campaigns." It was the time, he recalled, in which stories from across the ocean such as the Digitas IPO made him dream about what could be. "You heard the stories of students selling their websites for millions, and obviously, I followed those stories," he said. Dreaming of similar riches, Kustermans started a website for telling jokes, and when that wasn't an immediate success, not everyone can be funny or die, an IRC chat portal called Cyganet. The uncle of another mutual friend of ours, who was equally attracted by the success stories from the dot-com boom, decided to invest €25,000 in the company. Soon Cyganet was expanding rapidly, even though it had only 2 employees, Kustermans as the commercial brain, and his Ghent-based partner as the technical wizard. It was around that time that Kustermans asked me to make a regional news website for him. Chapter 13, The Unraveling. The 3 protagonists of this chapter didn't have a lot of time to enjoy their riches in 2000. David Kenny, most notably, was a multimillionaire for only 10 days. In the month following Digitas's IPO, the Nasdaq lost a third of its value, and so did the valuation of its companies, including Digitas and Infosys. But the worst was yet to come. In 2001, the year of the devastating attacks on the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York, the Nasdaq index again lost more than half of its value. By October 9, 2002, almost exactly 1.5 years after it had reached its all-time peak, the Nasdaq closed at its lowest level ever, 1,114 points. As a whole, the stock index had lost a massive 80% of its value, and hundreds of billions of dollars had vanished into thin air. Many companies went bankrupt, got sold for a fraction of their peak value, or simply ceased operations. The consequences for Chris Gopalakrishnan, David Kenny, and Raf Kustermans were dire, but because of the different stages that their companies and they themselves were in their lives, they all experienced the bursting of the bubble differently, reacted differently, and learned different things from these circumstances. The lessons learned from Synopthi: Chris Gopalakrishnan had known no riches for most of his life, and had to work for nearly a decade to achieve even minor success with his Infosys. It was only after those initial years of struggling that his company went through a decade-long exponential growth phase. Even with his Infosys shares losing more than 90% of their value since their peak moment on Nasdaq, they had still grown in value since their introduction on the U.S. market in early 1999, and were still worth more than 100 times their initial book value in 1993. It was probably for this reason that Gopalakrishnan didn't mention the dot-com crash as being an important turning point when we talked. He merely mentioned it indirectly, saying that the internet bubble created huge demand for software services, such as our own, and that we took advantage of that and grew very fast. What he did say, and even stressed, was that in the many early years of Infosys, as the founders went through tough times, they were able to ready the company for high growth later on. He said that during the company's first years it was not yet about size, it was about the work we did. And that was an important decision, because it forced us to do the things right, and to do the right things. During that time, we invested heavily in education, training, and quality systems. That focus on doing things right is what later enabled Chris and his fellow founders to grow the company to global dimensions, and to weather the storm when it occurred. Looking back, Chris said, in the beginning, we were not in it for the money. We wanted to build something to be proud of. We were willing to wait a little bit. If you want to build an institution, it takes time. If you want to get instant gratification or money, on the other hand, it will be very rare to build a successful business. In the end, Gopalakrishnan and his peers built Infosys into a global IT powerhouse. Infosys survived and thrived, and so did Gopalakrishnan. In 2007, he took the helm as CEO at Infosys, a position he kept for 4 years, and managed to double the company revenues from about $3 billion to $6 billion. He did so as the next crisis, the Great Recession of 2007-2008, was unfolding. Nowadays, Chris is Executive Vice Chairman. At the time of this writing, Infosys had doubled its revenues to over $8 billion, and its shares were trading at around $17, just 20% shy of their all-time peak in 2000. Gopalakrishnan is once again a billionaire. Infosys has gone from 7 founding employees in 1981 to more than 179,000 today. In the United States, it is one of the top 5 companies issuing visas. Chris remained calm when I asked him about the secrets to his success. Having seen the tide turn so many times over the course of his career, he pointed to luck as one of the clues to his success. Rather than talk about material success or titles, Gopalakrishnan talked about success as something much more intangible. People say, success is if you can marry your passion with your job, he told me. And when I look back, that is what has happened. I was fortunate enough to be part of something that is transforming society. Infosys is part of a technological transformation, and it is part of the change in India, which is going from a third world country to one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Today, India is known for its software, for its professional skills, and things like that. It's very satisfying to be part of all of this, and to be able to step back and say, this is how we are transforming lives, businesses, countries, and how we have helped to look at everything that we do in a different way. Chris's lessons, as I see it, are that before all else, you must believe in yourself, that you have to look for satisfaction in the present and your current activities, and that you should recognize the role of circumstances and of other people when you eventually do find success. The lessons learned from Raf Kustermans wholeheartedly agrees with Gopalakrishnan that it takes time to build an institution. You need to know whether you want to king or you want to be rich, Kustermans said as he looked back at his career. As he is once again building an internet company, Kustermans now aims to be king, meaning he prefers to build a relevant and impactful company, before aiming to get rich. But back in the early 2000s, he was the embodiment of the money-driven young gun. It is probably why his experience and learnings from the dot-com era are so different than those of Gopalakrishnan. After working on his Cyganet company for another year without much success, Kustermans and his business partner decided to call it a day in 2003. Many of his clients had closed their doors in the direct aftermath of the crash, and the pool of profitable clients became smaller as time went by. At the end, our operations had become such a mess that we were happy it was over, Kustermans told me without much regret. He sold the company to a competitor and recovered about half of his investors' money. He once again had to start over, with no successes and no college degree to back him up. I had to take a step back, Kustermans said. We had learned a lot with Cyganet, but at the end of the day, you have to put bread on the table, and we hadn't. There was no doubt what the whole dot-com bubble had meant for him, a failure and a setback. As for the regional news website that he and I were planning, it never materialized, and we ultimately shelved the project. After that, Kustermans continued to work as an independent contractor for ad agencies, doing a temporary contract here, a maternal leave replacement there, he said. In those years, he learned to sell himself and to persevere. I had to take one step backwards in order to take 2 steps forward, he said. You need to go through adversity, to hit a wall and get back up again. You have to understand that not everything will work and that everything can't be fun. Then, after a few years, Kustermans was ready to take his 2 steps forward. He started working with Mr. Bookmaker, an online sports betting site, and stayed with the company when it was bought a year later by Unibet, a much larger competitor. This time, Kustermans had joined a company for which the internet wouldn't turn out to be a bubble. Unibet and competitors like Bwin would gain notoriety in Europe, partly because of their unclear legal status in many European countries, and partially because they started shirt sponsoring some of the biggest sports teams on the continent. Bwin became the main sponsor of European soccer giants like Real Madrid of Spain and A. Milan of Italy. Unibet, among other ventures, set up an elite professional cycling team. Kustermans grew quickly within the ranks of the fast-growing company, just as many others did, following the logic of a rising tide that lifts up all boats. Within a year, he was transferred to the London offices of the firm, and received another 5 or 6 promotions in 3 years. In that time, I saw how a company can outright explode, Kustermans told me. We grew by double digits every month and doubled our revenues every 6 months. There were constantly new people around us, and everything we did turned into gold. On top of that, switching from the parochial Flemish countryside to the cosmopolitan London urban area made a big impact as well. Young people from all over Europe moved to Wimbledon to work for Unibet. It created a very special atmosphere, as both the company and all of us working for it were new kids on the block. With the Unibet experience under his belt, Kustermans consequently spent 1.5 years doing the marketing for Playfish, an internet game developer. Electronic Arts, known for Madden NFL and the FIFA series, had just acquired the company and wanted to develop it. It taught Kustermans about mobile gaming, virtual currencies, and social media like Facebook. Looking back, those consecutive assignments completed his skill set and network. After 1.5 years at Playfish, Kustermans in 2011 was ready to give startup life another go. Alongside 2 colleagues from Playfish, Gerald Tan and Jody Moran, he set up Plumby, a social casino company that specialized in slots games on Facebook. Gerald and Jody brought in financial and technological know-how, and Raf supplied the marketing knowledge. This time, it became almost an overnight success. In terms of technology, it was a culmination of a decade working at Cyganet, startup, Unibet, casino, and Electronic Arts, social gaming. In terms of building a team, it was in a way an encore to the Unibet startup culture, bringing together dozens of people from all over Europe to reside and work in London, living the work hard, play hard mantra. And in terms of money, it was a venture capital story from the book. Kustermans and his team collected $1 million in the seed round, amassed another $15 million in the second round, and continued to invest profits in the company afterwards, so as to keep building scale. As of the time of this writing, Kustermans said the company was profitable. Its signature Facebook app Mirrorball Slots had 1 million likes, 500,000 more than my employer, the World Economic Forum, and its slots game had brought in more than $50 million over the course of its lifetime. What were the lessons that Kustermans learned from the dot-com crash, and his subsequent long way to making it to the top? Success is a combination of luck, finding the right environment to grow in, and perseverance, he said. Regarding luck, he said that of course, working hard is an important factor, but if you look back on my course, and the road that brought me to Unibet, EA, and then Plumby, you have to admit that a part of it is also plain luck. No more and no less. The luck I had was that I found this job at Mr. Bookmaker, and got moved to London when it was bought by Unibet. In another life, I might have still been selling ads in Belgium, and have worked just as hard. On the right environment, he referred to his time at Unibet and EA in London, and how he met, among others, his Plumby co-founders. First, you want to work in an environment where you're inspired, which could be anywhere and in any sector, as long as there are the right people. But second, you shouldn't underestimate the geographical factor, he said. You'll be more likely to meet the right people in New York, San Francisco, Berlin, or London than in a village in the province. So if you're not born there, like me, you should move there. And on the perseverance and hard work, he said, I know very few successful people who don't work hard and persevere. In part, he said, it may also have to do with making sacrifices. I don't have a family and children, so I have a different life than most. I don't have regrets, but I do hear other CEOs saying often how they wish they had spent more time with their kids. But in the middle of the action, you don't think about that. Today I got up at 5 a.m. for a meeting in Guernsey, then had a flight back, had many emails to answer, phone calls to make, and a board meeting to prepare. Maybe in 5 years, I'll say to myself that I should have taken it easier, but for now, I don't have regrets. The final reward came in February 2016. Kustermans sold his company to a competitor, allowing him to cash in several $1 million for his investors and a nice, but undisclosed, sum for himself, too, next to securing employment for his employees. As I was preparing to meet him in London before submitting this chapter, I saw on Facebook that he had booked a long overdue holiday to New Zealand. After all the work, there was time for relaxation at last. The lessons learned from David Kenny. If Gopalakrishnan was able to remain zen during the dot-com crash because of his decades of patiently building a company, and Kustermans was able to move on quickly because he was just coming around the corner, David Kenny was stuck in the middle. He had amassed 20 years of professional experience and had plenty to show for himself, but all that was worth nothing when in the months following the IPO of Digitas, the stock price came crashing down from $24 at introduction to $88 during the days following September 11, 2001. During that time, the very existence of Kenny's company came into play, and with that, his reputation as CEO and his net worth as an investor. He owned 12% of the stock. As it was for so many people, 9/11 was a very unsettling experience for Kenny. Digitas clients such as American Express were among the companies leasing office space in the Twin Towers, and Kenny knew people who lost friends and colleagues in the attack, though no one Kenny knew personally was killed. Kenny himself was in San Francisco when the tragic events of 9/11 happened, and he couldn't get home for a number of days due to the closing of the airspace. I was scared, my family was scared, the people in the company were scared, and I had to stay in San Francisco and take one step in front of the other. The reason, of course, was the financial fallout from 9/11. Almost immediately, I went to look for cash, Kenny said. I needed to make sure we had enough cash to pay for the payroll. The stock price didn't matter, all that mattered was cash. But of course, the stock price did matter, and so did the underlying financial numbers of Digitas. And those were dire. When the markets reopened on September 12, Kenny said, everyone thought Digitas was finished, and the institutional investors, including Fidelity and Vanguard, sold off all or most of their stock. For the company, the phase of survival had started. The hardest moment came a month later, on October 11, 2001. On that day, which was supposed to be a celebratory one, given that it was his 40th birthday, Kenny had to fire a third of his personnel and talk to the shareholders about the, presumably really poor, quarterly results. To get through that period mentally, Kenny said, he was happy he could go back home to spend time with his family. It was important for me to go with the kids, he said. They were so young, and didn't have a clue what was going on. That helped, because it gave me a different perspective. Physically, Kenny persevered because of his health and fitness regime. I went to the gym every day, and I watched what I ate and drank, he said. Kenny also had already experienced the near demise of Bain, and had learned from Orit Gateish and Mitt Romney that it was important to keep in mind what the true north of his company was. I was completely composed when the crash happened, he said. Sure, I was disappointed, but you have to be very careful to not let the stock market decide your own idea of value. So he held on to what he had installed as the core principles of TH. That is the heart of, before I was CEO. If it helped, a quick subscribe keeps more summaries coming. So how do company and time connect? That is exactly where we started. Go back to the top and watch it click into place.